3 years ago, I met my grandfather for the first time. As a child growing up with my mother and grandmother, I had heard them talking about him, telling me about who he was, briefly, and only when I asked. As I grew older, I became more interested in who he really was, starting to question my mother, who didn't say very much or was answering vaguely. So I asked my grandmother, who had actually lived with him. They had my mother very young and separated quickly thereafter, and between the lines I noticed that it had to do with his drinking habits. I started to look for information about him and found out that he lived in an apartment by a metro station I passed twice a day. For months I was thinking about how to reach him properly. I didn't want to frighten him. I didn't even know if he knew I existed, how he would react if I made contact. He had a new life, a new family. Would he deny me? One day I sat down and wrote a letter, handwritten, the old-fashioned way. I figured he would like that, and I posted it the same day. And I waited. A week later I received a letter from him. He wanted to meet me, my mother and my grandmother, at a pastry shop near where he lived, and so we did. That was one of the most exciting days of my life, and I think it changed me more than I realize. The best thing, except just for the chance of meeting him, was that I noticed that we had things in common. I had not looked at it that way until then. I understood why I was interested in certain things in life, how I looked at life in general, because he was the same. I finally understood, at a higher level, who I was and from where I had gotten parts of me. He was happy to see me, and at first we didn't say a word to each other, tears glistening in his eyes as he hugged me. This little stout man, who, by the looks of it, had lived a rough life. He didn't look at all like in the pictures I had seen of him, but then again, they were 60 years old. And since that day we have met a couple of times every year to share a meal, have a cup of coffee, or just talking about things that interest us. It's like having an old friend, as it is difficult to see him as my grandfather. And every time I think of him as my grandfather, I can barely believe it. It is a strange feeling, difficult to describe.